Spain married a 14-year-old to her own uncle and called it a rescue. Her name was Mariana of Austria, and for roughly 2 centuries Spanish history books filed her under the same heading, the weak foreign widow who sat on the throne while the empire rotted around her. A Habsburg girl shipped down from Vienna, easily led, ruled by priests, blamed for the decline of a great power. That version of her is wrong on almost every point that matters. She was not weak, and the rot was not hers. What was rotting was the blood, and the blood had been dying for 3 generations before she was born. The 4th of September, 1649, 10 in the morning, the harbour at Denia on the Valencian coast. A girl steps off a ship after 14 months of travel from Vienna. She's 14 years old. The man she has come to marry is 44, and he is her mother's brother. A month later, at a small town called Navalcarnero, they are married in person, and the wedding night is spent at El Escorial, the granite monastery palace north of Madrid that doubles as a royal tomb. There is a story from those first days that tells you everything about the collision she was walking into. Cardinal Trivulzio wrote to Rome that when the girl first saw the court dwarves at El Escorial, she laughed, out loud. The Spanish protocol officers were appalled because a Queen of Spain did not laugh out loud at anything. Within a few years she had learned the court's frozen, closed-mouthed non-smile, the expression Velázquez would paint onto her face for the rest of her life. Start with the number, because the number is the whole story compressed into 3 digits. Geneticists measure inbreeding with something called the coefficient of inbreeding, written as F. It estimates the probability that the 2 copies of any given gene a person carries are identical because they came from the same ancestor twice, down 2 separate lines of descent. A child of 2 unrelated parents sits near 0. A child of first cousins sits around 0.0625. A child of a brother and sister, full siblings, sits at 0.25. Mariana of Austria came in at 0.155. To put that where it belongs, across every queen who married into the Spanish Habsburg line, she was the most inbred of all of them. The range ran from about 0.001 at the low end, a French princess named Elizabeth of Valois with almost no shared ancestry, up to Mariana's 0.155 at the top. Her own brother Leopold, who became Holy Roman Emperor, measured 0.1568. Brother and sister, raised in Vienna, walked into adulthood carrying almost exactly the same genetic load. Then both of them married it forward. Leopold married Mariana's daughter. Mariana married Philip IV. The 2 marriages went off on the same generation from opposite directions. Now do the arithmetic on what her marriage produced. Charles II, the only son who survived, measured 0.2538. Hold that against the figure for a child of full siblings, which is 0.25. The King of Spain, born to an uncle and a niece who were both Catholics in good standing, married in a cathedral with a papal dispensation, carried the genetic signature of a brother and sister conceiving a child together. Legally, nothing improper had happened. Biologically, the line had walked straight into the one thing every human society on Earth has a taboo against. The strangest fact in this whole grim ledger almost never makes it into the popular telling. An uncle marrying a niece, if both of them start out unrelated to everyone else, normally adds about 0.125 to their child's F. Mariana and Philip added only 0.085. Charles came out lower than the uncle-niece penalty should have produced. Why? Because there was barely any fresh consanguinity left to add. The family had already married its cousins to its cousins so many times that the supply of distinct ancestors had nearly run dry. Statisticians have a flat little term for this. They call it ancestor saturation. The Habsburgs had run out of new grandparents. You can watch the family tree eat itself if you follow Charles II's ancestry backwards. He should have had 8 great-grandparents, and he had 4 of them. He should have had 16 great-great-grandparents, and he had 6. Go back to where there ought to be 254 separate people standing in his pedigree, and you find 82. Every single one of his 8 great-grandparents traced back to the same couple, Joanna of Castile, the one history nicknamed Joanna the Mad, and her husband Philip the Handsome. One woman, Joanna, sits in slot after slot after slot, the same name repeating down the chart like a needle stuck in a groove. It did not stop with Charles. Mariana's daughter, Margarita Teresa, the one sent to Vienna to marry Leopold, had a daughter of her own named Maria Antonia. That granddaughter measured 0.3053, higher than a child of brother and sister, higher than the incest line, with no incest anywhere in the legal record. Maria Antonia died at 19 in childbirth. That is the end of Mariana's direct bloodline. 2 generations down from the Queen, the genetics simply closed the account. The physical evidence everyone half remembers is the jaw. The Habsburg jaw, the heavy protruding lower lip and the long undershot chin you can see in portrait after portrait. For a long time that got treated as a family quirk, a recognisable look, the way the Bourbon nose was. In 2019 a team finally tested it properly. They took 10 maxillofacial surgeons, the people who rebuild broken faces for a living, and had them score 66 portraits of 15 Habsburgs, blind, with no names attached. The surgeons rated each face on 2 separate deformities, the jutting lower jaw, called mandibular prognathism, and a sunken underdeveloped upper jaw, called maxillary deficiency. Then they lined the scores up against each person's F. The match was clean. The more inbred the individual, the worse the jaw in a straight dose-response curve. F alone accounted for roughly a fifth of how severe the lower jaw deformity got. The link to the collapsed upper jaw was even tighter. The worst lower jaw in the entire set belonged to Philip IV, Mariana's husband. The worst upper jaw belonged to their son Charles, who could barely chew his food. And the least deformed face in the whole study, Mary of Burgundy, the outsider who married into the family at the very start, before the cousins began marrying cousins. The deformity tracked the inbreeding so neatly that the researchers concluded the jaw was not some vague polygenic tendency, but a recessive trait, the kind that surfaces when you inherit the same broken copy of a gene from both sides at once, which is exactly what happens when both sides are the same family. Something has to be said plainly here, because a lot of videos get this wrong. None of this comes from DNA. Nobody has opened the royal crypt at El Escorial and sequenced these people. Every genetic claim about the Habsburgs, every F-value, every conclusion about that jaw is built from pedigrees, from the paper trail of who married whom, across 16 generations and more than 3,000 individuals. It is rigorous work. It is not the same as a swab. When someone tells you science proved the Habsburg curse, what they mean is that mathematicians reconstructed it from the family tree. The bones themselves have never been asked. All of this lands hardest on the children because she had 5 of them and watched most of them die. Margherita Teresa came first in 1651 when Mariana was 16. Then a string of losses. A daughter, Maria Ambrosia, who lived 15 days. A son, Felipe Prospero, who started having epileptic seizures at age 2 and was dead before his 4th birthday. If you look at the Velázquez portrait of that boy, there are amulets and charms pinned to his clothes, little protective trinkets against the sickness everyone could already see coming. Mariana wrote afterward that she could not describe his suffering, that the doctors had tormented the boy so badly they only hurried him into the grave. Another son, Fernando Tomas, gone at 10 months, 3 of the 5 dead before the age of 5 in a country where the village rate for that was closer to 1 in 5. Her children died at roughly 3 times the odds of a peasant's. Charles arrived on the 6th of November 1661, 5 days after his epileptic brother Felipe Prospero was buried. Mariana wrote to a friend in Vienna that the new baby was strong, in good health, the prettiest child she had ever had. He was sterile, chronically ill, and unable to chew his food properly. There is no crueler sentence in the family's correspondence than a mother calling that child the prettiest she ever had. How does a child end up married to her uncle in the first place? Not through any plan of her own, obviously. Mariana was born on the 22nd of December 1634 at Wiener Neustadt, not in Vienna proper, whatever most accounts say. Her father was the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III. Her mother was a Spanish princess, Maria Anna, who happened to be the sister of Philip IV of Spain. So from birth, Mariana was Philip's niece. She was not supposed to marry Philip, she was supposed to marry his son. The original plan, arranged in 1646, paired her with her cousin Balthazar Charles, the Prince of Asturias, the boy who would inherit Spain, a sensible enough cousin marriage by the standards of the house. Then it fell apart inside a year and a half, twice over. In May of 1646 her mother died in Linz from complications after a stillbirth. That October, her teenage fiancé Balthazar Charles died at Zaragoza, 16 years old, of smallpox, after a banquet thrown for him by the Aragonese assembly. There is an old story that one of the king's ministers arranged for a prostitute to give the prince his fatal illness on purpose, but that one belongs to 19th century gossip and shows up in no document from the time, so leave it where it lies. So inside 18 months, a girl of 11 lost the mother who raised her and the boy she was meant to marry. The Spanish crown, suddenly short an heir, did the cold dynastic math. The bride who had been lined up for the dead prince was still available, still a Habsburg, still useful. Philip IV was a widower in his 40s with no living legitimate son. Why send the Austrian girl home when the king could marry her himself? His chief minister, Luis de Haro, pushed the Nice match through against the grandees in Madrid, who would rather have gone hunting for a French bride. The proposal letter went out in 1647. The girl was 12. The journey to Madrid took 14 months and turned into a slow-motion diplomatic standoff. There was a proxy wedding in Vienna in November 1648, where an archduke stood in for the absent groom. Then the convoy left and almost immediately got stuck. For 6 months it sat at Trento in northern Italy, going nowhere. The reason was the Peace of Westphalia, which had just ended the 30 Years' War, and which Vienna had signed without bothering to keep Spain in the deal. Madrid was furious about it, and Spain refused to send the fleet to collect its new queen, until she was standing on Italian ground that leaned the right way politically. A teenage girl spent half a year parked in the Alps as a bargaining chip between her father's empire and her uncle's. Eventually the fleet came. She sailed from Finale Liga in late August 1649 and landed at Denia 2 weeks later. Then the wedding, then El Escorial, then the rest of her life in a country whose court rules forbade her to laugh. Look closely at how she actually appears in the most famous painting of the Spanish court. In Las Meninas, the 1656 canvas everyone knows, Mariana is barely there. She shows up only as a small reflection in a mirror on the back wall standing beside Philip. When the Prado studied the painting with X-rays, they found that Velázquez added and altered that mirror image after he had finished the main composition, and that he seems to have built her face out of earlier portraits rather than from a fresh sitting. The Queen of Spain, in the defining picture of her own court, is a reused face in a mirror, painted in after the fact. The small girl at the centre of that canvas, the one everyone remembers, is her daughter Margherita Teresa, the same daughter she would later ship to Vienna to die. Philip IV died on the 17th of September 1665. Mariana was 30. Her surviving son Charles was 3 years old and visibly unwell, which meant somebody had to run the largest empire on earth until the boy grew up. If he grew up. That somebody was her. The old story says Philip's will deliberately boxed her in. He signed it 3 days before his death, and it set up a governing council of 6 men, a junta, to share power with the regent. The traditional reading was that this council existed to keep the foreign widow on a leash. More recent work flips that completely. The council was built to back her up, and what she did with it was the opposite of what a leashed woman does. She quietly stripped the junta of its authority and shifted real decision-making to the Council of State, the body she could actually steer. The will had a clause barring foreigners from the council. She got around it within a year by promoting her Austrian confessor, a Jesuit named Juan Everardo Nithard, making him Inquisitor General, which handed him a seat by the back door. Her 2 great court favourites both came to bad ends, and both are worth a sentence. Nithard the Jesuit lasted until a coup chased him out of Madrid in February 1669. He went to Rome, got made a cardinal and died there. The second was a more colourful character, a smooth operator named Fernando de Valenzuela, whom the court called El Duende de Palacio, the palace ghost, because he had a habit of slipping into the Queen's apartments at odd hours by the back stairs. He climbed from nothing to Prime Minister and a grandee's title in about a decade. When it ended for him, it ended hard. 10 years of exile in the Philippines, and then death in Mexico after a fall from a horse. While all of that palace intrigue ran, Mariana was doing the actual work of holding Spain together against the most aggressive man in Europe, Louis XIV of France. This is the part the old legend cannot account for. When Louis invaded the Spanish Netherlands in 1667, she sent the governor of Flanders letters of credit worth 600,000 escudos and 1 million silver bars to fund the defence, and then she helped stitch together an alliance of England, the Dutch Republic and Sweden that frightened Louis into settling. She pushed through a peace with Portugal in early 1668 to free Spain up for the French fight. The settlement she got at Aix-la-Chapelle that May cost Spain a handful of towns, Lille and Tournai and Douai among them, but it kept the bulk of the Spanish Netherlands in Spanish hands, which was a far better result than France had been planning to allow. She also cut her own household budget to pay for the war. A frivolous foreign queen does not slash her own allowance to fund the defence of Flanders. There is one decision in her record that is genuinely hard to defend, and it is the one that mirrors her own life back at her. Mariana arranged for her daughter, Margherita Theresa, to marry Mariana's brother Leopold, the emperor in Vienna, uncle and niece. The exact structure of Mariana's own marriage, repeated one generation down. Margherita went to Vienna in 1666 and was pregnant almost without pause for the rest of her short life, 6 pregnancies in roughly 6 years. She died at the Hofburg in March 1673, 21 years old, carrying her 7th child. Her letters home from Vienna are full of homesickness for Spain, for her mother, for the Spanish women who had come up alongside her. Mariana, who knew exactly what an uncle-niece marriage did to a young woman because she had lived inside one, sent her daughter into the same machine. The thing that finally knocked her out of power was not the French and not the genetics. It was her own stepson and her own son working together. Don Juan José of Austria was Philip IV's illegitimate son, born to an actress called La Calderona, and he had spent years circling the regency with ambition and a grievance. In December 1676, 24 grandees signed a manifesto demanding Mariana be removed. On New Year's Day, 1677, Don Juan José marched out of Zaragoza toward Madrid with around 15,000 Aragonese troops behind him. 2 weeks later, on the 14th of January, the teenage Charles II slipped out of the royal palace to the Buen Retiro and, prompted by the men around Don Juan José, ordered his own mother to leave the capital and retire to Toledo. She went. In March 1677, she moved into the Alcazar of Toledo and set up what amounted to a shadow court, writing to her son constantly, signing every letter the same way, "Tu madre que más te quiere," your mother who loves you most. She was not finished, she was waiting. Don Juan José ran the government for 2.5 years, and then, in September 1679, he died. Mariana was back in Madrid that same month. The first thing she did on her return was arrange her son's marriage, to marry Louise of Orléans and resume governing in everything but title as the Queen Mother. For all of this, she was dressed the entire time like a nun. The day her husband died, she put on the white widow's coif and the dark habit, near enough the dress of a poor Clare, and she wore it for the next 31 years until she died. The famous late portraits by Correno de Miranda show her in that severe black and white get-up, but look at what she is doing in them. She's seated at a desk, papers and writing tools in front of her, a woman governing, not a woman praying. Her days ran on a fixed schedule, up at 5:30, 2 or 3 masses before breakfast, council papers from 10 in the morning, convent visits in the afternoon, devotional reading in the evening. She had also, earlier in life, done something genuinely strange with her clothes that says a lot about how she understood power. There was a monstrous Spanish hoop skirt called the guarda-infante, a cage that pushed a woman's skirts out to absurd width. Spain had banned it in 1639, and the ban came with an insult built in. The only women still allowed to wear it were prostitutes, who had to wear it as a badge of shame. Mariana brought it back and made it royal. She turned the thing into a kind of armour, a silhouette so wide it physically claimed space in any room she walked into. And a useful one too, because under all that structure she could hide a pregnancy or a grief the court was not allowed to see. The strangest piece of her legacy is one almost nobody connects to her, even though it sits on every world map. In 1668, a Jesuit missionary named Diego Luis de San Vitores took a Pacific island chain the Spanish had been calling the Islands of Thieves and renamed them the Marianas, after his patron the Queen Regent who was funding his mission, and after the Virgin Mary at the same time. Those islands are Guam and the Northern Marianas, a United States Commonwealth today, and the deepest point in any ocean on the planet, nearly 7 miles straight down, is the Mariana Trench, named for the islands, which were named for her. The lowest spot on the surface of the earth carries the name of a 17th century Spanish queen, almost nobody remembers. One last thing that trips up nearly everyone who reads about her. Her real name was Maria Anna in the German and Latin of her birth. Mariana is the Spanish squeeze of those two names that she adopted once she reached Madrid, and it is how she signed her Spanish letters. To make it worse, her own mother was also a Maria Anna of the House of Austria. Two women, mother and daughter, with effectively the same name, one Spanish-born and one Austrian-born, married into the opposite court. Historians have been mixing them up for centuries. She died on the 16th of May, 1696, around 11 at night, at the Uceda Palace in Madrid, where she'd moved while the old Alcazar was being renovated. She was 61. What killed her was breast cancer, a tumour in the right breast that her physicians recorded. By the accounts that survive, she refused most of the laudanum she was offered, stayed lucid enough to dictate final letters to her son, asking him to be merciful to her servants, and died holding a fragment said to be of the true cross. They buried her at El Escorial, in the Pantheon of Kings, the same granite pile where she had spent her wedding night 47 years earlier. 4 years after her, on the 1st of November 1700, Charles II died too, childless, the last Spanish Habsburg. With him, the Spanish branch of the family that had ruled half the world simply stopped. The marriage arranged to keep the dynasty alive produced exactly one surviving king, and he was the one who ended it. For 200 years, the verdict on her was settled. A 19th century historian, Cánovas del Castillo, and later the physician essayist Gregorio Marañón fixed the image of a weak foreigner run by her confessor, and that image stuck. It took until the last 15 years or so for historians, led by Sylvia Mitchell, to go back to what Mariana actually did and find a competent, independent ruler who held a declining empire together against France, and got blamed for a collapse that was written into the blood before she arrived. The decline was real, it just was not her doing, and it was not even mostly political. It was genetic, and it was already most of the way finished when a 14-year-old stepped off a ship at Denia to marry the uncle she had been handed to. Her bloodline died in 2 generations. Her reputation took 3 centuries to recover, and it only just has.